Good afternoon. This is Media Center Ukraine Odesa. We continue for today. Our current speaker is Vira Yastrebova, attorney director of the NGO Східна правозахисна група, Eastern Human Rights Group, who will share details about human rights violations in the temporarily occupied territories. Good afternoon. I would like to thank Media Center Ukraine Odesa for the possibility to be here today and to inform our society and the journalists about the processes that the temporarily occupied territories have been seeing. As for the social and economic situation of our people on the occupied territories, the processes imposed by the occupier, including forced deportation and forced mobilization, including students, and also the full collapse of the healthcare system and the lack of access to elementary social services. Every day the situation only gets worse. And of course, I must tell about the crimes on the temporarily occupied territories by the aggressor, not only against adults, but also children. And I would like to start with the fact that, unfortunately, there is increased orphans on the temporarily increased numbers of orphans on the temporarily occupied territories. And we've seen the crime of the Russian Federation against Ukrainian children, namely forced deportation. We can say that there are more than 7,000 orphans in the children's homes on the occupied territories. The question of their origin remains open. And there are several factors. First, these are the consequences of the forced mobilization of the male population of the occupied territories. And many families were left without men. Respectively, these are incomplete families. Through so-called commissions that allegedly check the state of the family, just take children from their families. The second factor is that the repressive activity of the commissions aims at children who just stay with their grandparents because their parents were killed. Thirdly, there is a social economic collapse in the occupied territories, and many families have been left without means of living, and one of the parents just has to go abroad to work to earn money, but unfortunately the situation is getting worse. So the occupier includes children to the so-called databases of orphans. And currently they have been established so-called child ombudsman job in the occupied territories of Luhansk and Zaporizhzhia regions. The so-called children's ombudsmen have already been imposed. Why do they need this? This is the changed tactics of Putin and his minion Lvova Belova. They have not stopped deporting children. They have just changed the modus operandi. In the mid of April this year, children's ombudsman, this is Lvova Belova, and her curator Anna Kuznetsova, plan to include as many children as possible to so-called orphans data bank and to connect them to the all-Russian Federal Orphan Children's Data Bank. What is this? This is an online platform, kind of a catalog, with all personal data of orphans, potential new families from Russian Federations can select children in those data banks. So this is a well-developed illegal business for adoption children. They have the term, which is professional parents. This is a well-developed system that allows such professional parents to receive money from federal and regional budgets, allegedly to spend for their newly adopted children. That's why in Russia there is a great number of people who are ready to adopt kidnapped children. The parents who are ready to adopt kidnapped children from Ukraine have undergone the training to prove that they will be raised children according to the currently imposed ideology. This is the hatred against Ukraine. So they will bring up the future possible soldier of the Russian repressive government. So what do we have as a result? There is a clear chain of activities aimed at deporting Ukrainian children from the temporarily occupied territories. But the occupier is now changing the approach, introducing a new technology for the deporting children when so-called professional adopting parents who are supported by the Russian Federation will just arrive to the occupied territories to take children, and after selecting a child from the catalog. And we understand that it will make even more difficult for us to fight against the illegal deportation, and it will make it even more difficult to ensure return of such children to their families, because the Russian Federation changes the data of origin of such children. And we know that Ukrainian government and Ukrainian officials have been taking efforts to prevent this deportation and to have families their children back. These are kidnapped children. These are children who have relatives, but the occupier just kidnapped children from their families. As for preconditions of this deportation, I've mentioned quite difficult social and economic situation. Now, there are delayed payments of salary in all areas. Including coal mines, which are in the occupied territories, and also the metallurgical plants of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Medical workers in the occupied territories also cannot receive their salaries. As for the priorities of occupation authorities, so there are no surgeries provided to local population because the priority is now soldiers of the Russian Federation. who can still receive their salaries. These are representatives of law enforcement bodies, which are responsible for introducing the repressive policy of the Russian Federation on the temporarily occupied territories. Those who interrogate people, those who make searches in the households of Ukrainians, who try to oppress Ukrainians who support Ukraine, who do not want to receive the passport of the occupier. I don't want to call it the passport of the Russian Federation because this document is the passport ID of the occupier. The total arrears from wages in the occupied territories of Ukraine amounts to more than 700 million rubles. This money has been provided by the Kremlin to keep order there, but no payments are made. This debt is artificial to hire people in law enforcement bodies. There are also known cases when the representatives of occupation authorities came to hospitals that do not pay wages and just made campaigns among doctors and medical personnel for them to join military units. So they are now trying to force doctors and medical workers to join illegal military units, trying to lure them with irregular payments. As for the general situation with the coal mine industry, it is catastrophic. We can see about signs of genocide of workers on the occupied territories. The Russian Federation has destroyed the work movement. It has destroyed enterprises, depriving Ukrainian working in coal industry to work and to ensure energy security of Ukraine. If we compare the situation before the occupation in the Donetsk region with the current situation, we can see the following. In 2014, there were 96 coal mines in the territories controlled and with more than 150,000 people working there. Coal production of these enterprises before the occupation in 2014 amounted to more than 65 million tons of coal per year, and the average salary before Russia just occupied the Donetsk Oblast in 2014 was the equivalent to $1,200, $1,800. So we can understand the level of wages for coal miners and those who worked in this sector. In 2023, 18 mines are still there in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, of which only 2 are still operating, but at 30% of their preoccupation capacity. In total, there are 8,000 to 12,000 people that are involved in the coal industry in the occupied territories. This means that Russian authorities have forcibly mobilized people, and before that, they had just looted those enterprises. At the moment, those criminals who have occupied the Donetsk region are now in the situation when there are no more enterprises, there is no capacity of those enterprises, everything has been destroyed by Russia, and this is evidenced by the numbers that we can get. Their propaganda just says about 8 years since 2014, but we can see what they have done during those 8 years with the territory of Ukraine that they have been fully controlling. In June 2023, a commission from the Ministry of Energy and Coal Industry of Russia worked in the occupied territories of Ukraine. They made the following conclusion: 12 mines in the occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk regions will be closed after the 10th of September this year. In June 2023, the weight debt owed to miners by the occupation authorities amounted to more than 39 million rubles, and this is only in the temporarily occupied territory of the Donetsk region. Apart from reducing the number of mines, the occupiers has also decreased the number of coal mine workers as a result of the forced mobilization and the result of zero investments to the development of enterprises, and also the result of looting of the mentioned enterprises. The dictatorial regime of the Kremlin, their minions, destroyed the coal industry of the Ukrainian Donbas and physically eliminated the miners' labor movement. The trade unions on the occupied territories of Ukraine are simply tools of the occupiers who are not engaged in protection of workers' rights, but on the contrary, they have been helping the occupiers in forced mobilization and in prospertization of remaining workers who are still there on those enterprising. They willingly participate in propaganda events. They also support the Kremlin policy, and they get reward for that. But unfortunately, we should say that the Russian Federation and its policy have just destroyed the miners' labor movement and the consolidation of the real trade unions. The forced prospertization is still ongoing. There has been recorded a case of the woman that died in the settlement of Telmenova. She refused to get the occupier's passport, and she could not get any food, and she died of famine, of starvation. The Russian Federation is actively introducing prospertization among elderly people because due to their physical condition, they cannot work, they cannot earn money, and they depend on the payments, on humanitarian aid. And the prospertization units have been actively working with the elderly. They do this to introduce as many locals as possible in the so-called elections. And this is one of the tasks of the forced prospertization, namely to increase the number of Russian citizens. It is known that 32 political parties from Russia will participate in the elections in the occupied territories. These are the parties that we have been able to identify. We also know about 8 political technologies from the political scientists of the Russian Federation who will organize pseudo-elections. And they have been tasked to ensure the turnout of 70% of the population, but they cannot do this. That's why they have amended their activities. So they have imposed additional controls not to give any support, including food, to the locals who have not received Russian passports. And they have also informed that they will force people to participate in the elections with any document that allows to identify their personality. The Russian Federation will try to integrate the election process those people who have been deported from the territory of Ukraine. So they will just force people to vote in other regions of the Russian Federation, and their votes will be considered as those as if they were just on the occupied territory. And the next topic is mobilization that has been ongoing since the first day of the full-scale invasion. You're well aware about how the Russian Federation worked with the temporarily occupied territories before the full-scale invasion. Those people who were forcibly mobilized from the territories of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic and were involved in a military activity in Ukraine after the full-scale invasion is just like spare material for the Russian Federation, because the Russian Federation is not interested in sparing lives of the locals who remember how it was when these territories were still as part of Ukraine. The repression machine just sent people to death, just involving them in the military activity against Ukraine. A big number of people who were forcibly mobilized have been taken captive or have been killed. And that's why the occupier turned to students. Parents just go on single protests. For their children not to be involved in the war, but the occupation authorities use the like force machine for torturing parents and their students. They force them to sign contracts. And those students who sign contracts are sent to the front line. Why do they sign these contracts? Because they are forced to do this by the occupation authorities. The occupation authorities promise them that then they will have the opportunity to study free of charge and that they will be employed. But there is no possibility to effectively protect themselves against the activities of the occupation authorities. Unfortunately, the occupation authorities just interfere with lives of all strata of the population. They deport children, they deprive children of their education and normal life. Their never-ending activities as a part of propaganda. So there is, they also, the people just cannot buy medication, cannot get medical services. These are the people who refuse to cooperate with occupiers, but there is still, like, they feel pressure every day, and it is very difficult for them to survive in the occupied territories. And apart from that, there is the social economic collapse that we can see with the utility services. Currently, in the occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, water is supplied 2-3 times a week for 1-2 hours. This affects all spheres of life, including medical, industrial, and of course agricultural. People cannot even water plants they are trying to cultivate to survive in the occupation. In hospitals, the priorities given to the military civilians cannot get medical aid. There are no surgeries provided for civilians. All these factors just make it barely possible for people to survive. And the numbers that we can see now, they are terrifying. They're and these are the prices that just several times more than in Ukraine or in Russia. And bread can cost up to 600 rubles in some of the towns because of the logistical issues, and it is even more difficult to get meat that can cost 1,500, 1,300 rubles. Canned food, 750, 2,000 rubles. So those shops that are still open is just for those who introduced the occupation policy and to those people who receive significant financial support. These are the people that work in the law enforcement bodies. And administrative arrests are ongoing. So there are the new administration detentions. And people are involved in labor activities, including in the territories closer to the contact line. And they can be wounded there. What else? We can speak about the activity of the occupation authorities. They seize vehicles on the occupied territories of Ukraine. So there is the pretext of violating the curfew, and they use it to seize vehicles from people. It started on the 24th of June this year, and they have just approved the law on the amending the code of the Russian Federation in the part of administration offenses. They seize vehicles of people. So the vehicles are sent to the special areas, platforms for further reselling. So people just lose their vehicles, and the occupation authorities, they just use this to earn money. Unfortunately, we must say that as of today, occupation authorities, they just only increase their terror over local population. And the Kremlin does everything it can to impose even further terror on the local population. Earlier, I already mentioned about the prisons for people for further deportation. So they do everything possible just to get rid of the Ukrainian population. They want to substitute the Ukrainian population with the Russian population. They just offer benefits for Russians who are ready to travel to the occupied territories of Ukraine. Thus, their aim is just to eliminate the identity and to raise the memory of people who still remember how it was under Ukraine. But people are still believe and they still have hope for the peace to be there. But unfortunately, the enemy does everything possible to destroy it. And I would like to thank the armed forces of Ukraine for their everyday hard work, bringing us closer to the victory. And the people there are waiting for that. And I know this personally because I have contacts there. And we try to do everything possible for the peace to be returned to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your report. Are there any questions? And there are no questions, so then thank you for being with us today, for sharing the updated information about the violation of human rights on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and we hope to see you again here. The next briefing will be at 1 p.m. We will have with us the volunteer from Finland, so stay tuned.